we have a very special guest who's a longtime friend of mine and colleague of mine for many, many years, and that's Paul Shapiro, who is both a scholar of distinction and was for many years director of the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and who's now director of international relations. Paul, I'm not going to call you Dr. Shapiro because it would seem artificial, but I'll use your first name. Paul has been to the Ukraine many times. He is an expert on that region, most particularly on Romania. And Paul has worked in the Ukraine, most especially with gathering Holocaust archives as part of the museum's project to rescue the evidence, which now becomes ever more important as we see that the evidence can be endangered by the political situations that are developing. Our topic today is going to vary from the nature of the Holocaust in Ukraine to the contemporary situation, and also to the, I think it's fair to say, Paul, you would agree that the misuse and abuse of Holocaust analogies as part of the conversation regarding the Ukraine. We welcome you, Paul, and we welcome the people who have joined us for this. And I guess we all can say that we're perplexed and chagrined to live in a world in which what we speak about historically is of direct significance and relevance to contemporary events. Would that we lived in a world in which this could be consigned to history. But the reality is the issues that are raised by the events that we grapple with impact our contemporary history and shape our conversation. Paul, tell us a little bit about your own background and engagement with Ukraine.
Well, it's a long story, Michael. I'll try to make it shorter. I was actually trained as a specialist on Eastern Europe at a time when Eastern Europe and Soviet Union existed as communist countries. So I was trained as a specialist in communist affairs. But of course, in all of those countries, the presence of Jews, the reality of anti-Semitism, the history of the pluses and the minuses of Jewish history in that region were always present, and they interwove with communist political issues very, very regularly. Just remember the state-sponsored anti-Semitism of the Soviet Union as a sort of prime example after World War II. Coming from that background, I worked for quite a number of years in the US Foreign Affairs establishment, working on issues of communism, combating communism, serving as an editor of a journal on communist affairs that was produced by the US government, but always had the Jewish part of the story of that region somewhere in the back and increasingly in the front of my mind. When the Holocaust Museum began to explore the possibility of collecting source material on the Holocaust, I wanted to be a part of that. And beginning, I think the first time that I traveled for the museum, which was then a museum in planning stage, was in 1989, going to Romania and a couple of other countries, including Kyiv.
Kyiv, which was then Kiev instead of Kyiv.
That's right. To explore the possibility. And of course, what happened then in very rapid succession was the disappearance of the communist regimes and the ability to actually collect source material that had been closed and sealed off for all of the post-war Soviet decades. And that took me to places that were repositories of that material, to Odessa, to Mykolaiv, to Mariupol, to Zhytomyr, to all these cities that most Americans would not be able to locate on a map and perhaps never heard of, but today we've heard of them because they are under attack.
So let's give some historical background. First of all, our audience should know, our participants should really know that one of the reasons that there were massive numbers of Jews in this region was that this was the region in which Jews were permitted to live. This region was part of the Pale of Settlement, and consequently it had an intense, a large and significant Jewish community. And many American Jews who say my family came from Russia really mean my family came from this region of the Russian Empire, which Mr. Putin seems to want to reestablish. This is an area which we should also give a couple of words of historic background. This is an area of what is called double occupation. It was first, explain that to our audience, double occupation, and in certain respects, double collaboration is a language that we can use. And double occupation means it was occupied by the Soviet Union, it was part of the Soviet Union, and then it became occupied by Nazi Germany. And what happened to the Jews as it became occupied by Nazi Germany?
Well, have to remember the war, the German assault on the Soviet Union began in June of 1941. By the middle of July, German forces were confronted with the fact that there were lots of Jews who they saw as enemies in the territories that they were conquering. And the question was raised, what do we do? What do we do with these people? And the first decision was, well, collect the men because they might fight against us and kill them. But very, very quickly, by the end of July of 1941, decisions are made for the mass extermination of Jews wherever they're encountered in the territories being occupied, the territories of the Soviet Union. And this was driven both by Nazi racism and anti-Semitism, also by that notion that they fostered and promoted throughout the region of Judeo-Bolshevism, that if you were going to fight the Bolsheviks, you were going to fight Soviet rule, a primary enemy were the Jews, because they managed to convince people that all Bolsheviks were Jews. Now, of course, it's not so that all Jews were Bolsheviks. In fact, a very slim a number relative to the massive number of Jews. The mass killing of Jews in the region is what is so distinctive. We tend to think about the Holocaust as Jews being deported to isolated locations, to camps like Auschwitz or Belzec or Treblinka, from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka, where they're killed there. In the territory of the Soviet Union, Jews were massacred as they were encountered, very often gathered together, taken just outside of city limits, and executed by gunfire, not by gassing and so on.
And this is now called the Holocaust by bullets, one by one by one, village by village, town by town, community by community, men, women, and children. And one of the largest executions occurred in what was then called Kyiv, and that's Babyn Yar, which occurred between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, 1941. And 33,771 Jews were slaughtered at Babyn Yar. 2 days, massive slaughter. And under communism, Babyn Yar Memorial was built at Babyn Yar, but what was unique about it under communism and what changed as the communist world evolved? Tell us a little bit about that, Paul.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and in a way sad story. One thing I would say, just to add to the picture that you provided, Michael, yes, it's true that Jews, men, women, and children were massacred in the way that we've just described. The majority of those Jews actually, were women and children and old people, because men had been drafted into the Red Army and taken away, or some managed to flee without families, if their families were not able to move, elderly parents not able to move. So in many of these mass shootings, what you find is a predominance of women and children and very old people. And as we look today, just to bring us forward, as we look today at the separation of families that's taking place as a result of the Russian attack on Ukraine, there's an echo there about the helplessness of these victimized people because families have been separated and potential protectors taken away. Let me come to this question of the monument. You know, for many, many years.
Well, let me only interrupt for 1 second, Paul. We should also explain what you well know, that the Jews living in the Ukraine did not have real accurate information about what was happening in Germany and in the occupied areas in German-occupied Poland, for example, because in the period between between September 1939 and June 22nd, 1941, Germany and the Soviet Union were allied. And consequently, they were not expecting the type of vicious anti-Semitism, murderous, genocidal anti-Semitism that immediately came. And part of that, and one of the things that they couldn't conceive of was that the Germans would kill women and children. And consequently, many men sought to escape, not because they were abandoning their family, but because they were the ones who were endangered. And little did they imagine that women and children would be the targets equal to men. And in fact, there's a document which said, why do we murder the children? And one of the answers that was given in the conversation, as I recall, is essentially because they're going to grow up and seek revenge.
Yes.
And consequently, children had to be murdered because, after all, they would remember and they might grow up and seek revenge. Talk for a moment about the monument. We should also stress, by the way, as one audience member participant has also said, that the other people murdered alongside the Jews in these villages, hamlets, towns, and cities were Soviet commissars and Roma and Sinti, who are pejoratively called gypsies. So though Jews were the primary victim, they were not the sole victim at this point. And we'll talk about that, but tell us a little bit about the monument.
Well, there is a Soviet era monument on the site of Babyn Yar, erected in 1976. That's 30 years after the end of the war. Why so late? Well, it's important to remember that after World War II, the Soviet Union became an anti-Semitic state. And the subject of the particular targeting of Jews and murder of Jews during the Holocaust was a non-subject. It was a taboo subject. In fact, knowing that Michael and I would have this conversation today, I went to my bookshelf and pulled off this book by Anatoly Kuznetsov, Babyn Yar. Was the first time that the subject of the mass killings at Babyn Yar was allowed to make it through censorship and appear in the Soviet Union, 1966. So for 20 years, there's no discussion even of the presence of such a massacre. Comes to people's attention through this book, through a poem written by a very famous Soviet poet, Yevgeny Yevtushenko. And there begins to be a bit of memory of the fact that—
a symphony by Shostakovich.
Correct.
So it is remembered and trying to pierce the censorship, but the word JEW,
right,
was like the equivalent of the word you didn't say not because it was pejorative, but because it all of a sudden got you in political trouble.
So that monument, built in 1976, has a dedication, and it's dedicated to the peaceful Soviet citizens who were murdered by the fascist Nazis. This is Soviet terminology. No mention of Jews, no mention of the specificity of Jews. That actually is the monument that was mentioned recently in the news as potentially damaged by Russian bombing.
And they damaged the tower next to the monument, but not the monument.
Right.
And the other thing we should say, I remember I visited that monument on Tisha B'Av 1976.
Mm-hmm.
I was there and I walked around the monument, and what was very interesting to me was there were a significant number of people you could recognize as Jews who were old enough to have been alive in 41, who were walking around and observing it in the own way. We looked at each other, we nodded at each other, we understood why we were there. And with the exception of a couple of refuseniks, those who were denied permission to leave, nobody spoke. But I remember it very distinctly. But under recent Ukrainian leadership, they were planning, and you've been working with them. Tell us what they were planning to do on the very site that they couldn't mention the word Jew.
It actually takes another 15 years. And it's only after the fall of the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, that a menorah is built as a memorial to the Jews who were murdered at Babyn Yar. And that menorah still stands, and it's where commemorations today take place, commemorations of that massacre of September 1941 that Michael described earlier. Then there's another lengthy period during which there are several efforts to create an educational memorial on the site, because a menorah is a menorah. It's nice, it's a place to meet, it signifies Jewishness, but what actually happened at the site, this is still a mystery to most of the Ukrainian population.
Well, it's even larger than that, Paul. You and I both worked at the Holocaust Museum, and one of the important parts of the design of the Holocaust Museum is we tell the story before we enter the memorial. And that is that a memorial works for the generation that already has memory, but for the new generation that does not know what happened, you must tell the story and only then go to the memorial. So the attempt is made to build an education center.
Right. And so there were several efforts to begin to create an educational memorial at the site. Each one made a bit of progress and then failed. One idea was to create a memorial garden at the site where people would confront little bits and pieces of the history, but they would never really be exposed to the whole story of what happened there. Second was to tell the story of the site, because the site of Babyn Yar is much more than the Holocaust. In fact, the Ukrainian Academy came forward with a proposal to tell a 2,000-year history of the site, in which, frankly, the Holocaust would be a very small piece. What happened in the middle of the last decade, in 2016, was a group of private individuals, let's call them wealthy individuals, came together and said, we will fund the creation of a private memorial institution at this site. And some serious work was actually done to design what the content might be. And then those wealthy individuals who were controversial in the eyes of most Ukrainians because they were oligarchs of Ukrainian Jewish background who made their money in the Russian Federation. So you can understand politics and history come face to face at that moment. And that has led to a very up and down several years in which there have been moments when you think, okay, they're actually going to create a serious memorial that will teach people. And then there have been moments when you would just hold your head in your hands, wring your hands, and say, this is not possible. They will sensationalize the history in a way that is not respectful of the memory of the people who were murdered. Today, and that remains the situation today. There is an effort to create something called the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. They're doing some interesting research. So far, they have not begun the process of designing the exhibition that they want to show to the public. And here I turn to Michael because he knows how complicated creation of a serious exhibition on the Holocaust is, because he was the principal in creation of the exhibition at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. So many of us from the outside, and that includes me, are pressing them all the time to begin that serious design, because if you don't, until they demonstrate that they're prepared to show the history as it was in the context in which the history took place, it's very difficult to engage them.
And you know,
let me just make one last little thing. They have done things, some things, to create a positive image. They have an international board on which there are very distinguished international figures from Israel, from the United States, from Germany, from other places. But having a very impressive board is not the same as getting the work done. And there's some distance between where they are today and where they need to be. Nevertheless, for a country that often is depicted as being a very anti-Semitic country, the fact that they're engaging in this effort with support from the government, with moral support from the government in Ukraine today, that's a quite dramatic shift from the Soviet era and from the reputation that Ukrainians often have of being more anti-Semitic than other countries. I don't agree with that reputation on their part, but it's quite a dramatic shift.
Let's go through a little bit of history and touch on this. Number one, the Russian-Ukrainian relationship was shaped by events of the 1930s as well. And that is that the Ukrainians had Ukraine, we have to understand, is the breadbasket of Europe. It's got enormously, wonderfully fertile soil and was really one of the sources of food. That's one of the reasons Hitler had his designs on it. It was the breadbasket of Europe, but Stalin tried to change the way in which crops were grown, denied them seed, denied them farm equipment, and you had the Holodomor, which was the experience of starvation. And people don't know how many people died, but somewhere between 3 and 5, 6 million people died, which meant that it is in the ancestral memory of contemporary Ukrainians that what came out of Moscow could be deeply deadly. And I don't think Mr. Putin appreciated how deep that is. In Jewish memory, we'd have to say the Ukrainians, and we've been asked, Who killed the Jews in Babyn Yar? The Jews in Babyn Yar were killed by the Germans, not by the Ukrainians. In other countries, by the way, there were in Lithuania, for example, 2 out of 3 Jews who were killed by Lithuanians. In Estonia, 100% of the Estonian Jews were killed by Estonians. But the Ukrainians did serve as collaborators, and they served to staff Treblinka and Belzhytz, for example, both had staffs of 90 Ukrainians and a much smaller number of Germans. The Ukrainians were those who backed up German troops in the Warsaw Ghetto. These were Ukrainians who had been promised national independence from the Soviet Union, and therefore turned and collaborated with Germany. So there's been a long historical tension between Russia and the Ukraine, even as it was part of the empire and part of the Soviet Union. And this tension is not new. So you have an interesting thing of Putin seeing it from one side and the Ukrainians seeing it from a very different side. Let's talk for a moment about the analogies that are being used to the Holocaust. Let's ask you a very simple question. You know this area well. How preposterous is it to take the Putin narrative that he's engaged in denazification?
In my opinion, you can give some definition to what Nazism was and would be today. Now, fascism is based on authoritarian rule and ultranationalism and glorification of some past leader, and definitely anti-democratic. And the Nazis intensified all of that into strongman rule, only one leader who knows all the answers, biological racism, Lebensraum, the idea that someone else's territory is actually territory that you ought to control. If you use characteristics like that and look for them in Ukraine, you don't find them.
But you find them, you find echoes of this.
You might find them someplace else where you have aggressive, militaristic behavior, denial of the right of an ethnicity to have its ethnicity, one-man rule. You know, just remember, Ukraine elected 5 presidents during the term that Vladimir Putin has been singularly in control of the Russian Federation. So it's just absurd, but it's not absurd if you consider why did he do it. He did it for domestic propaganda purposes. Soviet Union lost over 20 million dead in World War II at the hands of the Nazis. When you say that someone is a Nazi, it generates on the part of the broad breadth of Russian population hatred of whoever that Nazi, supposed Nazi is, and fear of whoever that Nazi is.
It also shows us dramatically the power of propaganda.
Absolutely.
Propaganda that's not working in the West because everybody says, wait a minute here, how the hell do you have a Nazi state and a Jewish president?
Yes.
Doesn't make sense,
Right.
Doesn't seem to work. But that's not a narrative that's heard as Russia clamps down on all the means of understanding.
It's also built on this broader notion that somehow Ukrainians were the worst collaborators. And we have it in the West. There are many people who think that in the West, or have been brought to think it. And there are many people in the Russian population who think it too. My own sense is you have to look at the issue of collaboration in a broader context. Yes, there were Ukrainians who volunteered to serve in military forces alongside the Germans. And yes, the killing of Jews, some Ukrainians actually participated in various actions. It's different in form, but it's not really different in lethality from, let's say, the actions of the countries that were allies of Nazi Germany, of Romania and of Hungary, where the state administration participated in deportations and actual killing. It's not so different even from the Netherlands. Okay, it wasn't Dutch civil servants and Dutch police who pulled the trigger, but it was Dutch civil servants who used the records to identify where Jews lived. And it was Dutch police who arrested the Jews and turned them over to the Germans. So you have a form of collaboration in Ukraine that is quite stark and shocking, because it's face-to-face killing. It's different in form, but it's not different in lethality. And it's not particularly different in proportion or percentage of people who are actually involved.
But Paul, we hear this in virtually each society because there's a difference between being killed by, or being killed, persecuted by someone you expect to be an enemy, and very different by someone you presume to be a neighbor or a friend.
Yes.
And we hear echoes in survivors. The Poles were worse than the Germans. Poles were not worse than the Germans. The Germans were responsible for this, and they could have organized it as systematically and as disciplined a way, et cetera, et cetera. So when you speak of collaboration, you have to understand that the collaborators were secondary players. Now, we've been asked by someone here about the Holocaust was created to murder Jews, but as historians who are responsible, we have to indicate that Jews were the primary victim. They were not the only victim, but there was only one final solution. It was the final solution to the Jewish problem, and the annihilation of the Jews, what the Nazis called extermination, was the pivotal, the axis which gave rise to this massive evil. And let me just say, because the person commented did anonymously, that the Nazis targeted homosexuals in Germany and in Austria, which was then became part of Germany. It was not a priority and not a significant source of their desire to victimize them elsewhere. They regard that as part of the degeneration of the culture that was involved in them. Somebody asks, how Jewish is the president?
President Zelensky came to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum just a few months ago. He made a point of ensuring that representatives of multiple Jewish organizations of the United States were present, and he presented his family history. His family history is one in which he lost most of his family in the Holocaust. He didn't speak to religious faith, but his identity as a Jew is very clear in his own mind, and very clear in the mind of the population that voted him into office. I'll say again, it's quite astonishing that 73% of the Ukrainian population voted for a Jewish man to lead the country, and they are now following him. It's an extraordinary illustration of what is possible, I would say again, in a country with the reputation that's often applied to it. that that can be the case.
I had dinner with the president on January 26, 2020. And the date is very significant because he was going to be the speaker at the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Soviet Army. And the Poles did not want to invite Putin to address the event because of all of the issues involved with President Putin and the fact that they don't quite regard it as liberation. So they invited President Zelensky, and I happened to, I won't say the circumstance on which I happened to sit next to him at the occasion, but it was to prevent a political opponent of his who was trying to sit next to him at the same occasion. And he made it clear that not only were his relatives, his grandparents, victims of the Holocaust, but the other point was that his grandfather, was one of the people who fought for the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. And even if he did not want to be known as a Jew, he is known as a Jew. And he understands that that's a tool. And by the way, that doesn't make him easy on the Jews. His remarks to the Knesset on Sunday were enormously controversial. And he also has maybe an exaggerated sense of the power of Jews that comes from his own experience in this situation. So it's intriguing to watch him do this. Let's turn to another issue, though, that we're seeing with a very different outcome now, which is the problem of refugees.
This is really a serious issue. And again, with an echo from the Holocaust era when so many millions of people were displaced. The fact that the countries that border Ukraine on the west are accepting refugees, that's quite admirable. They're very quickly being overwhelmed by the huge flow of refugees. How many of those people will ultimately be able to go home, choose to go home? How many of them will look for refuge elsewhere remains to be seen. I think there's a policy issue there for the United States of America in terms of acceptance of refugees. And then one has to square the issue of, well, we are open to these refugees. The East Europeans are open to these refugees, but just remember they were not open to refugees from Syria. They were not open to refugees from North Africa. And there is anyone who thinks that racism is less forceful and present today than it was 20 or 50 or 80 years ago, it's a mistake to think that.
And we also have to remember that when the refugees were Jews, the boat was full, the door was closed. Right. There was not that sense of openness. So one sees it's possible, but part of it is these are people of the same culture and of the same, fellow Slavs, fellow Eastern Europeans. And there's an echo of that in the Holocaust in the sense that the Swedes were prepared to receive Danish Jews. And that's what allowed the rescue of Danish Jewry of Denmark to take place. I'm not sure they would have received Eastern European Jews.
These refugees are also women, children, old people. I would guess people who are perceived as not being able to make too many demands. And I think that attitudes are shaped by that too. If these were whole families with men present, the response might be different as well.
Well, with the fact that the men are not present indicates to some people that this is a temporary, rather permanent thing. Hopefully the men will not be slaughtered, so you're not dealing with widows and orphans over the evolution. Paul, we have avoided what you and I have no particular expertise on, which is predicting the future. And I know you're speaking in your own thing, not as an official. When you speak on the history, you can speak as an authoritative scholar. If you had to say, what do you think happens over the short term and the middle term? What do you think is happening?
I don't think it's possible to predict. A week ago, I would have said the Russians will occupy the whole country, and then they'll have to figure out what to do with it. Today, it seems that that might not happen. On the other hand, the destruction, the massive destruction of human life and of buildings and culture and so on, that massive destruction will take decades to rebuild. I do know that part of the world quite well. The progress that's been made since the fall of the Soviet Union has been impressive on the one hand, but slow on the other. And to rebuild from the destruction that we're seeing is going to be a long-term proposition. The end of the conflict, of the armed conflict, however it ends up, is going to leave that problem to be addressed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure.